So there's this YouTube professor, he's called Professor Jang, and he's claiming that the US wants to lose the Iranian US war. And I wanted to look at it and analyze if he's actually saying something that's true or if it's just, bullshit and trying to get attention. He's going pretty viral right now, but we will look at it and try to understand if his analysis is right, because usually he just states statements and doesn't go deeper on the game theory part. And I had game theory in university, so I'll see if I can go a little bit deeper, and we try to see if it really makes sense that the US wants to lose the war. So first of all, he claims that the US wants to lose the war because this would make Europe and China more dependent on the US, because when the Strait of Hormuz is closed, then China and Europe have to import their oil from other countries that have a lot of oil reserves. For example, North America or Russia. What he's also claiming is that the US took over Venezuela because they already planned all that. They wanted to make Europe dependent on them and China by starting a war with Iran, and therefore, make them dependent on their oil. And that's why they took over Venezuela to have a lot of oil reserves to sell to Europe or China after losing the war to Iran. But what's also interesting is that he claims that they want to take over Canada because Canada also has a lot of oil reserves. But I'm really not sure about this. So we will dive deep into this and see if we can figure this out. So the first thing I wanted to analyze was to see if what he's stating is true. He basically says that China and Europe have the most oil imports, and that's why they are so dependent on other countries for importing that oil. And at the moment, it seems like that China and Europe are importing their oil, especially from Iran. And what I can see here is that he told the truth, because China is number one in oil imports, and there are a lot of European countries that import a lot of oil. Now I want to see if this is also oil that's coming from Iran or the Middle East at least. So I only found this article, and it claims that these are the most countries exposed by closing the Strait of Hormuz, and that's Europe, and it's even the US itself too, and especially China, as you can see. So let's give him that point too. If the Strait of Hormuz closes, Europe and China become dependent on other countries for their oil import. But I still don't believe that it would be a good strategy for the US to lose the Iranian war. But we will look into this more deeply now. And another claim I wanted to prove or look up is if it's true that that North America and Russia are the countries with the most oil export or the most oil reserves. And we can actually see that this is really true. So we have the Middle East, right? Saudi Arabia. Then on this second place, we have Russia and the US itself and Canada. And so that is also true. So the strategy in general could be true. It could make sense to lose the Iranian war to make Europe and China more dependent on the North America, so the US, or Russia. But Russia, so Russia wouldn't make sense, right? If It wouldn't make sense for Europe, especially for China. Russia would maybe make sense, but for Europe, Europe would turn to the United States and become dependent on the United States if the Strait of Hormuz is really closed. So now let's go through this scenario through a game theory perspective. If we really think this is the case, then we first have to list all the actions each player can take, right? So let's say, let's start with the US. So let's say the US has two actions. One is to purposefully lose the war, or send troops into Iran to force regime change. So Iran has at the moment not really a lot of options, but the options that they have is pretty effective. They can just fight and defend themselves, attack oil reserves in the Middle East in general, and close the Strait of Hormuz. So Europe has these two actions. They could now participate in the war and try to force regime change with the US, and therefore opening the Strait of Hormuz, or be passive. And China has these three actions. They can defend the current regime, therefore going into an indirect war with the US, be passive, or participate in the war to also try to force regime change and opening the Strait of Hormuz. So now that we listed all of the actions the players can take, let's see what the results would be of those actions. So if the US purposefully loses the war, Trump would stand in a bad light. Mr. Jang is saying that when the US purposefully loses the war, Europe and China would become dependent on the US for oil. But is that really the case? I feel like this is a pretty big bet on the US part if they really think that. Because we could now look at what other options Europe and China would have if that would be the case, if the US loses the war and the strait stays closed. So if the Strait of Hormuz stays closed, for China especially, Russia would be the better partner than the US, because I don't think China wants to become dependent on the US for their oil. Instead of, becoming dependent on the US, they would rather become dependent on Russia, I think. So I don't think that makes sense that he argues that China would become dependent on the US for their oil if the US is purposefully losing the war. So for Europe, it would make more sense to become dependent on US oil, but that is also not even that true. There are other options that Europe could take. They could look at Africa. There are some countries in Africa that have a lot of oil reserves. They could look at Norway. Norway has a lot of oil reserves. So I feel like this would be a too big bet for the US if they really gamble to lose the war, to make Europe and China dependent on them. It just, I don't really see that. So I don't think Professor Jang is really right on this path. It is for me more like a gamble, this prediction, because it could be true, but it could also not be true. So yeah, I don't think this is really 100% prediction here. I think rather that the US will send troops into Iran to force regime change. Either that, or I forgot another action, is to just leave the war. Just leave the war and declare victory. Because we know that good Donald, he would never declare a loss. So what I think, he would probably just leave the war and declare victory. Well, I don't think he would really do that, but I think this is more likely than purposefully losing the war. So I think it's either sending troops into Iran to force regime change, or just leave the war and declare victory by saying that they destroyed the oil production in Iran, or whatever excuse that they can use to say that they won the war. Let's say they send troops into Iran. What would that mean? That would either mean a quick regime change and everybody is happy, or it would mean a long war and a second Afghanistan. And this would mean everybody is unhappy. What would it mean if they just leave the war and declare victory? I think this would mean, I think this would be a pretty big loss for the US, because if they just leave the war, Iran starts to control who passes the Strait of Hormuz and who's not passing it. And I think they would I think Europe would become close to Iran and try to kiss their asses, kiss the regime's asses to get their oil. But Iran would stop, getting oil to the US. So this would be pretty bad for the US. Pretty bad for the US. Could be good for Europe because they would start kissing the regime's asses. So for Iran, I don't think I really have to talk about the consequences of their actions. I mean, either it's pretty much the same as here above with US. If it becomes a long war, they will be miserable. If it's a quick regime change, it's good for the people in Iran because then they would have Western puppets, but at least they would be more free. And if the US leaves the Strait of Hormuz and declares victory, it would be amazing for Iran or the regime, because then they could just control the Strait of Hormuz 100%. For Europe, the first action is again the same. So when they participate in the war, it could be a quick war. Everybody and they force the regime change. Everybody's happy. Western puppets will be the new government of Iran. That's really good for the people because the people would be free again. Of course, they would be ruled by Western puppets, but I believe they rather have this than a shit economy and so on. So for the people in Iran, it would be good. And their second option is to be passive, which is just which makes them just dependent on the actions that the US will take. For China, if they defend the current regime, they go into an indirect war with the US. I don't think they would really do that, to be honest, because this would escalate pretty quickly into, a massive global problem, and maybe even nuclear war. Because going into the indirect war with the US is already the first step towards a direct war with the US. And this would also probably trigger the Taiwan war. So I don't think they would really do that. I think they would rather wait for what's happening in Iran. And if the US wins, then it's okay because the strait is open again. And if the US loses, then they would just turn to Russia for their oil. So I think they will stay passive and see what the US will do. And also, I don't think they will participate in the war to try to force the regime change because they want to have all the responsibility on the US and not, get involved in this chaos. When we look at the whole picture and really go through the actions and not just listen to the statements Professor Jang makes, I don't really think that the US is really trying to purposefully lose the war. And that goes to show that every time you hear stuff like that online, maybe try to think yourself about it, because I think this is the biggest problem we have currently, that we are not making our own minds up. I hope I could, show you a little bit from a game theory perspective how to go through these scenarios. I'm not a game theory expert, I just had it one semester, but usually what you want to do is list all participants, then list all their actions, and then decide what their actions, what value it would get them, and usually then you can make yourself a better picture about decision making. I hope this helped to clarify a little bit, and yeah. Let me know if you like these kind of videos and if I should keep doing them.